Hello, everyone. My name is Naomi Masuoka, and welcome to my research-based presentation where I discuss the topic of aptitude in relation to second language acquisition. My initial research question is, what factors of aptitude have been researched, theorized, or even proven to affect second language acquisition in learners? I chose this topic because to me, aptitude is something that seemingly is a mostly natural process. So what does a natural process of the brain have to do with affecting language learning? Is it beneficial? Does it hinder it? Does it do a combination of the two? What research is there out there that proves that aptitude helps or maybe even hinders language learning? My main focuses are going to be defining aptitude in relation to SLA, the difference between implicit versus explicit aptitude, and particularly younger ages, in which I discuss one particular study where they teach French to preschoolers, but I'll get into that later. My methods of research were looking at primarily scholarly articles. All of them address the differences between implicit and explicit aptitude. They define aptitude as a whole and how it relates to SLA. Most of them are scholarly, and they're all pretty recent as well. I also want to point out that a majority of them are from Columbia University specifically. As I was doing my research, I found more and more articles from their teachers' college that addressed TESOL as a whole. So I went on their website and searched for more of my content, and I found a lot of recent sources on there that were very beneficial to my research. So let's begin with just defining aptitude. The Johnson O'Connor Foundation defines aptitudes as natural talents, special abilities for doing or learning to do certain kinds of things easily and quickly. So it's natural, it involves competence, it can be physical or mental competence, it can be developed or even left undeveloped if not properly addressed or ever practiced, and it can be implicit or explicit. So Sue Min Park of Columbia University compares implicit and explicit aptitudes in her article that I searched. But she first begins with discussing what aptitude tests are and how we even judge what aptitude is based on language. So John Carroll's modern language aptitude test is a much older aptitude test that I'm sure many of us have probably learned about, and it was addressed in our textbook a little bit. It involved phonemic coding, inductive learning, and grammar sensitivity. But over time, people decided that wasn't really the best test. So recently they developed the LLAMA, which is more language neutral. It involves vocabulary, sound symbol correspondence, grammar inferencing, and phonemic memory. So it's not just the explicit knowing what the language is or what the words mean, but it also has to do with the actual sounds and development responses and reactions to language. So let's compare implicit versus explicit aptitude. Sue Min Park states that explicit aptitude taps into cognitive abilities activated during explicit learning and processing, as well as rote memorization, while implicit aptitude taps into cognitive abilities related to implicit memory, learning, and processing. So that definition really just says explicit is explicit and implicit is implicit. What does that mean? Explicit has more to do with rote memorization, being told what to do, knowing exactly what you're looking at. Implicit is more of the unconscious process of learning. It's not just learning things without you even realizing it, but it's how the brain reacts to stimuli when we aren't even aware of it. I might hear a conversation somebody's having, and I'm going to automatically pick up on the words they're saying, not just have to focus on it or them tell me that they're speaking to me. I can just pick up on what they're saying through my implicit processing. So Adrian Mann and Wei Liu, also of Columbia University, discuss these definitional issues that have to do with explicit versus implicit aptitude, and they also come to a conclusion on what a good definition of implicit aptitude is. So they state that explicit, the MLAT test from John Carroll, those are more traditional approaches. They're behaviorist, and they focus primarily on the learner's rote memory and language analytical ability, thereby treating language as largely explicit. Just a lot of head knowledge, not really any natural processing. However, they do come up with the connectionist approach. The connectionist approaches to SLA, which are founded upon the metaphor that the mind is a network in which everything is connected, seem to make a strong candidate. So they state that a good definition shows that patterns, form, and external sources of learning connect the mind's natural processes. It's not just cognitive abilities and your brain being able to properly function, but it's how these external sources also work together with that. So it is a connection, a combination of the two. And that is where explicit and implicit overlap into discussing aptitude in relation to SLA as a whole. So Kristen Jaworski and Kelly Moser of Mississippi State University are professors in the Early Childhood Education Department. In a recent study, they observed a private Southern preschool with 12 children aged 37 to 48 months, so about 3 years old, and they called in a literacy expert and a world language specialist. But first, before we get into their actual study, I also wanted to address Ashley Becchia of Columbia University. One of her short articles studied the role of language rate in children's aptitude. She stated that there is a general understanding that L2 ultimate attainment is more consistent in younger children, but how it occurs is what needs to be researched. Studying further on aptitude specifically would demonstrate why we know children exposed to the same levels of language at the same time end up acquiring it at different rates. And we know that is a more general understanding that L2 attainment is successful in younger children. They still do acquire it at different rates, although we're not exactly sure why. But she states that explicit and implicit learners take different approaches. So she states a general statement, but then she also said that there are different approaches to this. And so Jaworski and Moser's research and results show a combination of the two. Again, that connectionist theory of how they really work together. You can't really have one without the other. So Jaworski and Moser worked alongside the specialists, and they used the FLEX program, which is a foreign language exploratory program. It's a program in which the educators would come in for a few weeks at a time. They met for this one for 10 weeks. They would meet a few times a week for 30 to 60 minutes. They would do simple activities with the children that immersed them in the language and culture. They stated that implicit learning is best for young learners. This was a statement they made right off the bat before they got into their research. They said that games, songs, books, manipulation of objects are things that easily work for children to understand, not just L2, but L1 as well, just general language development. But they also do address their sample size is a little small. It's only 12 children, and it's only those around the age of 3. They say that viable models still need to be empirically identified before educators are willing to make a significant change to how preschool curriculums function, especially since this is such a younger age. They are past that prime point of development, but they're not quite into the higher levels of education where they're recognizing why language is so important and how it's going to apply to the future. They're still so young that they're just learning the basics. And so further research needs to be done to see how to incorporate that into a preschool curriculum as a whole. So the results after observing the 12 children, their motivation and their level of attainment over the 10 weeks demonstrated that all of them were motivated. They were excited about the program, they were ready to learn, but sometimes they were unsure of what was going on. For instance, they would state that there was a song where they had to sing in French, they had to say, "Hello, my name is," but they didn't actually know where to say their name in the song. So there's that implicit aptitude of learning and memorizing the song, being able to sing it aloud, that phonemic memory using sound systems, but they weren't exactly sure what the explicit implications were behind it and what they were supposed to be learning. But there was an overall positive feedback from parents and children alike. They also said that they talked to the parents. They asked a few general questions of what the children already knew about prior knowledge, how motivated the parents were to teach their children language. And the majority of the students just primarily spoke English. There might have been one or two that spoke just a little bit of German or Dutch or Spanish in the home, but the majority of them just primarily knew English. And so they all were able to learn a little bit of French. And so they made a very bold statement and said that it is noteworthy that every child who consistently participated each week was able to acquire some French. So the program was certainly successful. All of them acquired language. And it is also plausible that most of the children remained engaged week after week due to using lessons that not only focused on their own worlds and everyday lives, but were also recursive in nature. So we have that rote memorization, repetition, the explicit aptitudes of being able to do something because you practiced it over and over. And there's not really that as much of a focus on just the everyday worldly implications and what they can use it for in their everyday lives. So there is kind of a little bit of both. There we see how it's rote memorization, analyzing, knowing exactly what to say, when to say it, being motivated by the educators, being possibly reprimanded for behavior if they weren't paying attention, being provided incentives, so they knew what they had to do, versus the actual unconscious learning process, where they were actually physically learning it in their brains, but they weren't exactly sure how that process worked. They didn't immediately recognize, this game is helping me learn these French words. They just knew it was a fun game. They were learning French, and they didn't understand how the two connected because they are so young. So the implicit aptitudes have to do with the unconscious process of learning. And it's not just you don't even recognize what you're learning, but it's how you react to the stimuli without even being fully aware. Just like I said, the natural conversation occurring where someone is talking to me and I just naturally respond because I know exactly what they're saying, but I don't have to sit there and analyze and memorize over and over my response to them. So in our textbooks, they address a little bit of aptitude in some of our chapters, and they basically go into, with our myths textbook and principles of language learning and teaching, they kind of just summarize what aptitude is. They don't really get into the implicit versus explicit. They kind of state more of the history of the tests and how we observe it in SLA. And myth number 7 specifically states that individual differences are a major factor in SLA, which is not necessarily true because there are many, many children that are being researched, and not all of them require an individual process to learn. All of them have those general aptitudes that they are good at. Some might be better at one subject than they are another, but everyone possesses those aptitudes. Sparks and Ganshaw found that L2 attainment is stronger in those with a better grasp on their L1. That's another one of those general statements where they show that as a whole, anyone who has a better grasp on their L1, has that better aptitude for language, is naturally going to be better than L2. But that doesn't mean that just everyone who's better at L1 is never going to give anybody else a chance at learning L2. Robinson argues that aptitude relates to a combination of different techniques in different settings. So there might be more explicit learners in one setting or implicit, and they might have to take those same approaches to each other instead of trying to combine all of them together. So it's not like explicit or implicit outweighs one another, but it's how you connect them together. Again, going back to that connectionist theory, they also address it here. How do they take the listening and learning and actually apply it? How does their brain react to those stimuli? How do they choose to go about learning it? There's also the phonological memory, which is more of an implicit aptitude that they address from Brown and Larson Hall, and that relates back to the Llama test, where there are more unconscious processes, but it also shows how they're applying it as well. And then in Principles of Language Learning and Teaching, Chapter 4 specifically just discussed further definitions of aptitudes and yet again those tests. They further summarize that aptitude has many complex definitions. There is the general term that it has to do with competence, and it is natural, physical, and mental, but they also go into how it relates to SLA. As well as the dynamic systems theory that they state, it says that multiple influences have to do with the development. So as a whole, there are many different techniques that one can use. It's not just saying that explicit or implicit is the way to go. The research that I looked at showed that you have to be careful of how you word them to make sure that you're properly identifying what you're looking at and how to go about it. They address that, the research is still not entirely done. They still need to look at children of younger ages. Some of these papers might have been from many years ago, so now they're trying to figure out how to redefine definitions and make these statements so we can further look at it in the future. It's not like it's a hopeless subject, but there are still many different points that need to be made in order to look at specific age groups, different types of aptitude, different styles of teaching as well, the specialist involvement and the world language as a whole, and what we do for the curriculum. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation. This is my works cited page in MLA format, and thank you all for listening to my presentation. I hope you all have a wonderful day.